everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, through the generous support of the Knight Foundation. And this evening, Books and Books, in collaboration with the University of Miami Center for the Humanities, is very happy to welcome Professor Karl Gunther and his new book, Reformation, Unbound, Protestant Visions of Reform in England, 1525 to 1590. And here to introduce Professor Gunther, please welcome back to the microphone our good friend, the director of the UM Center for the Humanities, Professor Miyoko Suzuki.
And thanks to Books and Books for another semester and actually the academic year of collaborating with us to present these book talks. And for those of you who were here last semester, our last book talk was by Hugh Thomas on the English Middle Ages, and within the space of 3 months we moved to the English Reformation with Karl. And I'd like to just point out before I introduce Karl that we have 3 other book talks this semester, ranging in topic from Roman satire to romantic women writers in England and Indian culture, to social identities and classic Mayan culture. So I hope you'll join us for those. And we have another roster of 4 book talks in the spring. So today, or tonight, I am very honored to introduce our speaker, who is a fellow scholar in early modern studies. So Karl Gunther, who works on early modern English history with a special focus on the Protestant Reformation, is associate professor in the history department at the University of Miami. He currently serves as the vice president of the Southern Conference on British Studies, to be president next year, and co-convenes the interdisciplinary research group on early modern studies at UM Center for the Humanities. He has been awarded research fellowships from the Folger Shakespeare Library and from the Center for the Humanities. His articles on English Protestants and Puritans have appeared in Past and Present, History Compass, Journal of Ecclesiastical History, and Archiv für Reformationsgeschichte. The book Karl will be presenting today, Reformation Unbound, Protestant Visions of Reform in England, 1525 to 1590, published by Cambridge University Press, was a finalist for the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize. Please join me in welcoming Karl Gunther to the podium.
Thank you. I was told to do that. Yes, a little bit. Thank you very much to Books and Books for hosting this. Thank you to Miyoko for that very kind introduction, and to the Center for organizing the study. And thank you very much to all of you for coming. I really, really appreciate it. In a book about baptism, written in 1533, while he was imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of heresy, an English evangelical named John Frith made a startling suggestion. Instead of observing the Sabbath on Sundays, as Christians had done for a millennium and a half, the English should start observing it on Mondays, or maybe Tuesdays. According to Frith, this reform was essential to combat the superstition that the medieval church had implanted in the hearts of the English people. Frith argued that while God had commanded the Jews to celebrate the Sabbath on Saturdays, Christians were free from the prescriptions of the Jewish ceremonial law, and not commanded to observe the Sabbath on any specific day. The leaders of the early church were free to observe the Sabbath whenever they wanted, and they could have continued to observe it on the same day as the Jews. But they changed the Sabbath day to Sundays as a memorial of Christian freedom. The Catholic Church, Frith argued, had since led people back into legalistic bondage, teaching them that it was necessary for Christians to observe the Sabbath on Sundays, an erroneous belief that he said was part and parcel of the Church's larger false teaching that salvation depended upon ceremonial observance. Frith concluded, therefore, that because the English were now, quote, as superstitious in the Sunday as the Jews were in the Saturday, yea, and we are much madder, it is at this time very expedient once again to overset our Sabbath, which is the Sunday, because the ignorant people do count it as necessary, unto the Monday or the Tuesday. Now, needless to say, the English Reformation did not usher in a Tuesday Sabbath. It would have been much more remarkable if it had. Most Protestants did not agree with John Frith, and even though he was a leading figure within the early evangelical movement in England and celebrated as a martyr after he was executed that same year, his proposal to transfer the Sabbath day to Monday or Tuesday was deemed so unacceptable by Elizabeth's reign that when the great martyrologist John Fox edited and reprinted Frith's works in the early 1570s, he simply deleted it. Fox's Frith became a supporter of the Sunday Sabbath. The margin read, "Sabbath kept on Sundays," where that passage should have gone. And Frith merely became an opponent of superstition about the Sabbath. In the 19th century, Thomas Russell perpetuated this distortion by employing Fox's emended edition when he reprinted Frith's writings in 1831, and the reliance of modern scholars on these editions continues to perpetuate this omission. Frith's call for a Tuesday Sabbath reveals one way in which evangelicals could call for a radical reformation in Tudor England, and it provides a particularly striking example of how radical visions of reform in the early English Reformation have been obscured from the historical record. Historians do not typically place English Protestants among the radicals of Reformation Europe. The word radical often functions as a shorthand for Anabaptists among Reformation historians, and radicalism in this sense of the word was exceedingly rare in the English Reformation. As historians of radicalism have argued, however, a more profitable way of thinking about Reformation-era radicalism instead uses the term to describe ideas, attitudes, or behaviors that fundamentally challenge the status quo in ways that were more extreme or extensive than those adopted by other reformers. Nevertheless, radicalism in both senses, was treated as a foreign concept in A.G. Dickens' magisterial The English Reformation, which proclaimed in its second edition 25 years ago that, quote, "modest and mundane reforms sprang naturally from our Tudor age, with its deep aspirations to good order in church, commonwealth, and society at large," end quote. According to Dickens, the preeminent English Reformation historian of his generation, English Protestantism was a unique form of Christianity called Anglicanism, which charted a theological middle way between Catholicism on the one hand and Protestantism on the other, since the English, and here I'm quoting Dickens again, have scarcely grasped the deepest implications of either Catholicism or Protestantism. We have tended to avoid the peaks and the abysses of both, and our greatest men have seldom found it easy to operate within the framework of either. According to Dickens, the institutional manifestation of this via media was the Church of England, an inclusive state church born out of, again quoting Dickens, a reformation of compromise and detachment, partly because these attitudes come naturally to the English temperament, partly in consequence of a patriotic distrust for foreign models, partly since both Catholic and Lutheran powers failed to comprehend our situation, but most of all because the divisions between Englishmen made it safer to attempt a settlement based on balance and comprehension rather than upon a narrow orthodoxy, end quote. From this perspective, the English Reformation was not only not radical, it was inherently anti-radical. Now, this is a view of the English Reformation and of the Church of England which has also taken root in popular culture. When the English comedian and actor Eddie Izzard attempted to explain the English Reformation to an American audience in his 1998 stage show Dressed to Kill, any fans? He offered a colorful analysis of Henry VIII's motives, too colorful for me to repeat here, and then suggested that these pragmatic beginnings imparted a decidedly lukewarm and muddled quality to the newly established Church of England. As Izzard put it, in the Church of England, quote, "you can't have extreme points of view. You know, the Spanish Inquisition wouldn't have worked with the Church of England," end quote. Rather than torturing heretics to obtain recantations, Church of England inquisitors would have politely offered them a choice between tea and cake or death. The views of Eddie Izzard notwithstanding, and I believe I'm the first historian to engage with him historiographically, the myth, and I mean myth, of moderate Anglican Reformation has been subject to devastating critiques over the past several decades. Scholars like Eamon Duffy have powerfully shown how destructive the English Reformation was for the adherents of traditional religion, while other historians have convincingly dispelled the notion that English reformers like Thomas Cranmer aimed at a via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. 16th century English Protestants were deeply enmeshed in the international world of Protestantism and would have viewed the entire concept of a via media between Protestantism and Catholicism as a misguided exercise in splitting the difference between truth and error. This body of scholarship has transformed our understanding of 16th century English Protestantism, But radical visions of reform within English Protestantism have nevertheless continued to remain marginal to our understanding of the early English Reformation, and tend to be treated instead as later developments, associated above all with the development of Puritanism. Beginning with Henrician evangelicals like John Frith and ending with the Elizabethan Puritans, my book, Reformation Unbound, revisits the development of radical visions of reform and godly activism during the English Reformation. It argues that there were early English evangelicals who were envisioning the Reformation in ways that were far more radical than we have hitherto recognized, and that some radical ideas and attitudes that typically have been viewed as later developments had been part of the English Reformation at its start. It not only expands our understanding of the intellectual boundaries of early English Protestantism, therefore, but it has implications for how we then view the later development of Puritanism in Elizabeth's reign. By expanding our understanding of early English Protestant radicalism, this book enables us, I would say requires us, to view some key aspects of later Puritanism in a new light, not as fundamentally new departures within English Protestantism, but as the continuation, and in some cases, the reappearance of ideas and tensions that have been developing within the English Reformation from its very start. For instance, historians widely view early English evangelicals as relatively unconcerned with issues of church government, seeing them as focused instead on doctrinal reform or liturgical reform. Calls for a root and branch reorganization of the church's government are seen as a new development, indeed a quintessentially Presbyterian development within Elizabethan Protestantism. I show, however, that there were Henrician evangelicals during the 1530s and 40s, including a figure of no less fame and importance than William Tyndale, who were calling in print for sweeping changes to the church's polity, advocating the abolition of diocesan episcopacy, clerical hierarchy, canon law, ecclesiastical courts, and demanding the exclusion of clergy from any role in diplomacy or government. A properly biblical church, these evangelicals claimed, would have a bishop in every city or parish, whose sole function would be preaching and parish ministry. They would have the election of clergy and the parochial exercise of church discipline rather than diocesan courts. A reformation of this sort would have transformed the English church and English society beyond all recognition, and it was a vision shared by neither Henry VIII nor by all evangelicals, especially not Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. To be clear then, by calling attention to these radical calls for reform under Henry VIII, my aim is not simply to reverse the judgment of earlier scholars like Dickens, to argue that English Protestant really was inherently radical rather than moderate or conservative. Rather, my aim is to show that the spectrum of opinion, especially on important issues like the reform of the church's government, was much broader than we have hitherto recognized, and that it contained voices that were far more radical than we have previously assumed. Recognizing these early calls for root and branch reform also then cast later Puritan radicalism in a new light. When English Presbyterians began demanding very similar changes to the church's government in the 1570s, they derived their ideas from John Calvin and Theodore Beza in Geneva, not from early English Protestants. And indeed, they seem to have been unaware that English Protestants had just a few decades earlier been advocating similar reforms. But, as I show in the book's final chapter, Presbyterians soon discovered these calls for radical reform. They were delighted. And they found them in the writings of early English Protestants. They began to conduct research. They began to pile up quotations against bishops and clerical hierarchy from evangelical books printed during the 1530s and the 1540s. And English Presbyterians found ammunition to claim that they were the true heirs of the English Reformation, not the bishops and their allies. This was sometimes a tenuous argument. There were very important differences between what the Presbyterians said and what earlier English Protestants said. And some of their arguments, while sincerely intended, could be quite fanciful. Some Presbyterians claimed, for example, that when the writings of William Tyndale had been republished during Elizabeth's reign, they had been issued cum privilegio, that is to say, with royal privilege or authority. And this is what all books that are authorized have. They have a stamp on the front that says that. As such, these Presbyterians claimed the status of English statute law for everything contained in that book, including William Tyndale's statement that the offices of Archbishop, Lord Bishop, Archdeacon, Dean, Parson, and Vicar were Antichrist. They said, this is now English statute law, and all Protestants must uphold Her Majesty's laws and throw down the bishops. This argument struck the bishops and their reporters as completely ridiculous, and they pointed out that licensing a book for publication did not make statute law. Lawyers. But the Presbyterian historical case was so extensive and so persistent that the bishops were forced to respond to it with their own set of pro-episcopal precedents from the reign of Henry VIII and Edward VI in order to secure for themselves the mantle of the early English Reformation. So seeing the ways in which Elizabethan Presbyterians and conformist Episcopalians came to pit different early English Protestants against each other, or sometimes against themselves at different points in time, further highlights how the early English Reformation contained a wide spectrum of voices, and some of them extremely radical, on these crucial issues. Many of my book's chapters focus on these technical debates within English Protestantism about the reform of church government, the church's liturgy and ceremonial life, and the problem of religious authority within the church. In examining these debates, I offer new interpretations of several episodes that play important roles in the standard narrative of the English Reformation. For example, there was a major controversy among English Protestants, admittedly not a household name, but in the city of Frankfurt. It's called the Troubles at Frankfurt, during Mary's reign. And this was about whether the exiles there should continue to use the Book of Common Prayer or adopt some new liturgy. This debate is very widely argued by historians to be the beginnings of the crucial divide, the very long-lasting divide between Puritans and conformists, or maybe an earlier generation would have said Puritans and Anglicans. But I argue that this controversy has been misunderstood. When we look at the issues at stake, we see that they were very different from the issues that would divide later Protestants. And when we look at the arguments that people actually made at Frankfurt, we find no conformist case. We find arguments that are used exclusively by Puritans during Elizabeth's reign for further reformation. In another chapter, I examine the first great Elizabethan debate between Puritans and conformists. It's called the Vestments Controversy. Again, I know not a household name perhaps, but in 1565 and 1566. And this was the controversy in which the word Puritan was coined, and first used to describe those ministers in the Church of England who refused to wear the clerical vestments that are required by law. They wouldn't wear the surplice, sort of a drooping white gown. While scholars have always assumed that this was an intra-Protestant affair, one that pitted one kind of Protestant against another and the Queen in the middle there, I show that actually English Catholics, surprisingly, played an enormously important role, one hitherto completely unrecognized, in sparking and then fueling this controversy. The positions that Puritans and conformists took during the controversy were actually in close dialogue with the aspersions of Roman Catholic authors. And in fact, those Catholic interventions played an incredible role in fueling the mutual hostilities between the two groups. As they attempted to respond to Catholic attacks, they tend to attack each other even more vehemently. In other words, Catholics are central to what seemed to be the ultimate Protestant controversy. So what chapters like these do in my book is not only offer interpretations of important episodes in the history and narrative of the English Reformation, but they give us a better understanding of the ways in which divisions were forming within English Protestantism during the middle decades of the 16th century, and of the ways in which those divisions gave rise to Puritanism in the Elizabethan Church. Now, in addition to examining ways in which English Protestants thought about church government and liturgy, Reformation Unbound also examines ways in which English Protestants envisioned Christian life, that is to say, Protestant life as far as they were concerned, in the aftermath of the Reformation. For example, Protestants had to address the conflict that the Reformation had produced in English society between supporters of the old religion and the new religion. There's a remarkable story where actually even children in the 1540s were forming gangs on the playground and taking on the names of the new learning and the old learning against each other. This is an organizing concept for conflict here. In a culture that was deeply, deeply supported by the ideals of unity and peace, any movement that created strife and discord could easily be discredited. Henry VIII himself envisioned the establishment of a national church under royal authority as a way to restore peace and unity among his subjects and to bring an end to religious strife and contention. Henry also famously, and it's a perfect example of his mentality, passes a law that bans contention. It's just against the law to disagree, no contention. Indeed, as like I say, the establishment of peace and unity are intrinsic to this project of creating the Church of England. But as I show, many, although not all, evangelicals took the view that preaching the gospel and living according to Christ's teaching not only would, but should, indeed must, produce conflict It must scandalize the ungodly and introduce what would be an unending state of strife in England between the followers of Christ and the children of Satan. Drawing on passages like Matthew 10:34, in which Christ cryptically promised that, quote, "I have not come to bring peace but a sword," these evangelicals developed highly agonistic visions of the Reformation, the church, and of Christian life, in which religious conflict was normative, and in which ungodly peace would be broken up by godly conflict, as the gospel went forth in a hostile world. For example, Miles Coverdale, probably best known for his work as a biblical translator, described the gospel as the god Mars in 1547, writing that, quote, "Where the gospel is preached, there is the sword. There is trouble and persecution. There will the enemy sometimes draw their daggers at the preachers thereof." Coverdale argued that since the followers of Christ would never consent to evil, and since the followers of the devil would never be reformed by the gospel, so, quote, "strife, I say, and debate shall happen this year because of the word of God." Surprisingly, this was not the only sense in which some early English evangelicals envisioned the Reformation as bringing a sword. In ways that we do not tend to associate with English Protestantism, some evangelicals urged their monarch to take violent action against the enemies of the gospel, cleansing the land of persecutors, punishing idolaters, and imprisoning or executing enormous numbers of popish priests. In a 1550 pamphlet dedicated to Protector Somerset, a Church of England clergyman wrote that the popish clergy were so devious, so persuasive, that the only way to protect the English people was to put them to death. Estimating that only 1 in 40 parishes, quote, "hath a true preacher or minister," end quote, he asked rhetorically, "Is it not, I pray you, much more expedient that 850 false prophets should be killed up by some Elijah than that the whole Israel should perish? Judge ye that have any wit in your heads." Tea and cake and death this was not, right? A few years earlier, another evangelical had sent a remarkable manuscript to Henry VIII, in which he proposed not death, but mass internment for incorrigibly popish priests. After an evocative account of how priests would subvert the Reformation in alehouses, he has this wonderful story with this imagined dialogue about how, after Sunday, the priest waits until his parishioners are drunk, and they're in the alehouse and they're hot in their ale, and he knows he can get them. And then the priest, the cunning priest, slides in, and he asks them, "How are prices these days? How's the market?" And his ignorant parishioners say, "Oh, prices are terrible. They're so high," but they're ignorant and they can't explain what it is. And he says, "I'll tell you why they're bad. Henry VIII has destroyed the monasteries, and this new gospel is ruining everything." And the manager's wonderful. They all sort of hail him, "Oh, Sir John, you good priest," and they bring him a cushion to come sit down, and he subverts them through this alehouse talk. So after explaining this, this person who sent this manuscript to Henry VIII urged the king to remove priests that would be incorrigible from their positions. He said, if there are some that can be educated, educate them. But the ones that are incorrigible, he says, send them to, quote, "some 1 or 2 places in every diocese to be appointed," end quote, where they would be contained forever, where they would receive a pension, where they would spend their time praying for the king and the realm. I've described it as a cross between a monastery and a concentration camp. It's a very strange proposal here. If this evangelical had his way, popish priests would not be executed en masse, but they would slowly die out under the crown's enforced hospitality. Now, English Protestants would taste the sword themselves during the reigns of Henry VIII and during his daughter Mary's reign, of course. And this occasioned a debate about how Protestants ought to respond to bouts of persecution and to royal commands that they participate in worship that they deemed idolatrous. While the bulk of the Protestant population, the vast majority, chose to conform by attending Mass, keeping their convictions to themselves and living to fight another day, a vocal minority within English Protestantism denounced these conformists as cowardly Nicodemites, so called after the Pharisee Nicodemus, who in the Gospel of John visits Christ under the cover of darkness. There's actually a very interesting debate about whether Nicodemus was a proper name for this, because as some of you will know, at the end of the Gospel of John, Nicodemus publicly claims Christ's body after the crucifixion. So some people said you shouldn't call them Nicodemites. Nicodemite, in fact, is about being public about your support. So anyway, according to the anti-Nicodemites, dissembling, as the Nicodemites did, was a heinous sin that threatened the Nicodemites' salvation and did grave harm to the souls of others who witnessed this act. While this was always the radical view of a minority, anti-Nicodemism was the view of an increasingly influential minority. And during Mary's reign, the Protestant exiles and soon-to-be martyrs waged a relentless campaign against Nicodemism in letters and pamphlets addressed to their fellow Protestants. As one historian has said, no occasion was too small to send a message not to go to Mass. What is important to recognize, particularly important to recognize about the anti-Nicodemite campaign, though, I argue, is that it would live on, surprisingly, after Mary Tudor died and after the official prosecution of Protestants ended. As I show in the book, Protestants surprisingly continued to produce anti-Nicodemite literature throughout Protestant Elizabeth's reign. I thought that was very curious. They presented this in part as a necessary preparation for future bouts of persecution that might come. Protestants needed to be on something like permanent anti-Nicodemite high alert and prepared to resist the temptation to dissemble when inevitably the wheel turned. But Elizabethan Protestants also identified a host of ways in which godly Protestants might continue to be tempted to dissemble their godly convictions, even in Protestant England. Attending Mass under a Catholic monarch was not the only way to Nicodemize, they said. And even after Elizabeth abolished the Mass and reestablished a Protestant national church, the pressure to dissemble Protestant belief could be felt in social, professional, and even ecclesiastical settings. A deep anxiety about denying Christ before men and then having Christ deny you before his heavenly Father would remain at the heart of the ecclesiastical and social activism of the Elizabethan godly, as they sought further reformation and sought to maintain an ostentatious Christian witness in the midst of a group of people they deemed irreparably ungodly. My time is nearly up, so I will return to the beginning, and that is to the cover of my book. I have to say, when I saw the flyer, which was very nice, Zuri, thank you, I was immediately taken aback because it had this image right next to my smiling face, and I seemed just horribly gleeful about what is happening in this image. When the book first arrived and I showed it to my children, they said, "Dad, what are they doing to that guy?" And I said, "Well, let's put this away. They don't need to see that." So this is a painting. It was commissioned sometime between 1538 and 1544 by Girolamo de Treviso, who was working for Henry VIII as an engineer. He actually dies as a military engineer for Henry VIII. And the picture depicts here the four evangelists, and they're each holding up giant rocks, and they're stoning the Pope to death. They have already done the deed to hypocrisy and avarice who lie dead besides the Pope. It's the Apostle Mark here is really winding up there on the left side. This painting, like all wonderful paintings, is amenable to many interpretations. Henry VIII, who commissioned it, surely saw in it his own white-hot hatred of the Pope, saw himself as a patron of the Word of God, as he very much did. But what I like about this image is that I think it reflects some of the key aspects of radical Protestantism that I've discussed here tonight. An insistence that the gospel requires the absolute eradication of every vestige of popery. It must be put to death. But also a sense that the Reformation process involves strife, it involves conflict. It might even necessarily involve violence. The painting has a title. I'm actually not sure when the title came about, but it's called A Protestant Allegory. And I think that's not quite right. There were quite a lot of Protestants who didn't think this way. But as I hope my book shows convincingly, there were quite a few who did. And their radical visions of reform and godly life are an important part of the story of the English Reformation. Thanks very much. Thank you. Very kind, very kind. I'm happy to take any questions and try to answer them. Dominique.
I know why you're such a popular teacher, and that was wonderful. Thank you. I had two questions that are the same, actually, to just give you an option.
Excellent.
Clearly, the moment is what's so exciting, these people that have high stakes in this world that they're trying to purify for how they see as the right. But in making this corrective of reintroducing our knowledge of these people and these passions, are you trying to reintroduce a history of an isle that has had radical Protestantism in it for quite a long time? And maybe this is yet another episode that we're trying to cover it up, and you're giving us yet another one of these moments, perhaps an origin moment for radical Protestantism that will then reconnect with 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century radical Protestantism in the British Isles. Or is your goal, or is it also your goal, to put this in a European story and see this as, although Britain is very different, it's not that different at all? What is your, I guess it's both, or maybe it's not.
It's definitely both. One thing that I think is important about this is how there's always been this presumption that the English Reformation is different. When you look at those maps of Reformation Europe and atlases, England is always the Anglican pink map, and it's different from the other Protestant ones. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of truly phenomenal scholarship that has shown that the English Reformation is very much part of this broader European Reformation. And what I want to show is that, in fact, not only is it part of the broader Protestant Reformation, the same kinds of problems and tensions and radical ideas that we think of as very normal popping up in Germany in the 1520s, revolution, Thomas Müntzer and his rainbow flag, and slaughtering the ungodly with the princes. That happened in England as well. And that's something that we're not as used to thinking about. So England has been integrated into the European Reformation, but I think it can be more so. As to the question about how it connects up, one of the things I'm so interested in, and I touched on it in the talk, is these ways in which later Protestants look back to history. The history of the English Reformation is always, I'm going to forget who said this first, but it's always a custody battle for the present-day Church of England. And I have no stake in that custody battle, but it's often fought in that sort of way. You can think about it even in terms of what books were edited in the 19th century and who decided to edit which figures. Did they edit 16th century figures or 17th century figures? What angle of the English Reformation do they want to show? Sometimes they want to cover things up. Sometimes they're just interested in one thing and therefore don't pay attention to something else. So one of the things that really interests me is tracing those connections, not by trying to sort of see genealogies of ideas as much as looking at how later figures read the history and try to appropriate those earlier figures. And that's something I really got interested to, especially near the end of the process in the book. 17th century Protestants are constantly digging through these books to sort of say, see, we're just like him, and therefore we are the true Protestants. There's some wonderful examples. In the 1640s, there's a pamphlet that purports to be a dialogue in heaven between William Tyndale and John Bradford, two great martyrs of the 16th century. And the way the pamphlet works is, I believe Bradford says to Tyndale, there are a lot of people that would love to read your books, but they're awful scarce. Could we just send back an epistle to people and let them know what we think? And he says, absolutely. And Tyndale then comes out strongly as an opponent of Archbishop Laud and Charles I. But it's important to think through Tyndale. It's important to claim that heroic figure. And part of that has to do with the fact that these people are martyrs. They died for this. And the Presbyterians, I mentioned that one tenuous argument. Presbyterians like to say that any early English Protestant who was martyred, if they said anything marginally against bishops, they're martyred for the Presbyterian cause. That's what they died for, which is not true. But it's a way of seeing that. And I think that's the avenue to understand ways in which this earlier history maybe relates to later histories of radical Protestantism. To this very day, the 5th of November is celebrated with a procession for the martyrs in Lewes. So that's very much alive. Yeah. Thanks. Yes?
Continental Europe, that so Protestantism was imported into England, or there was also an isolated process already going on with, I think, John Wycliffe and the Lollards. And where did that last thing come from? Was it also a kind of a new mentality in society where I think also, let's say, the realis presentia of Christ was not felt anymore in their blood and bones, so also not the unity was not lived anymore. Did it happen as an isolated process in England, or was there also a lively, already before King Henry VIII, lively import of these ideas? And when did that happen?
There's a very lively import of ideas. So Luther's works are being read very early in England, in German and in Latin. They're being translated early on into English. So there's clear Lutheran influences early on. As we go forward a little bit in time, well past the beginning of the English Reformation, the influences on England become less Lutheran and they become more broadly Reformed. From Zurich, especially, a lot of historians have been working on that recently. Eventually Calvin, but people like Bullinger and all of these European figures are certainly influencing English theology there. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can see the imprint of those ideas motivating early English Protestants. The question of whether Lollardy provides an intellectual source for these ideas is also vexed. Many of the people who become prominent early English Protestant ideologues and writers don't come from a heretical background. They are mendicants, they're priests, they don't have any background of heresy. So it doesn't seem like the ideas went into them through an earlier history with these sort of marginal groups. It certainly does seem the case that if we want to talk about the popular spread of the Reformation, which isn't something I really focus on in the book, that was very much aided by areas of Lollard's strength. There are certain affinities between Lollard focuses on Bible reading and Protestant focuses on Bible reading, and maybe there are some constructive misunderstandings between the two groups, but they go together. As to your last question, whether they have a certain decline or a decadent malaise at the end of the Middle Ages, I think that's probably not the case. Almost all of the evidence we have points to the absolute vitality, in many ways the white-hot vitality of traditional religion, the enormous investment that people put into it, the emotional force it continues to carry for them. And I actually think rather than imagining Protestantism emerging out of a weakening of late medieval piety, you can see it coming out of, in fact, a very vigorous, strengthened lay piety that can jump channels and jump lines there. I think that's probably a more likely scenario. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Miyoko.
So, can you talk a little bit about the shift in scholarship that you're talking about? Because it seems very interesting that there was this blind spot in the earlier scholarship about, and you're correcting that, right? So, what was at stake to see the English Reformation that way? Is it a matter of periodization? Because what you said about the 1640s seems to indicate to me that the English Reformation scholars were not thinking about the connection with the later Puritans and how the later Puritans actually looked to the earlier Reformation. And you just also said something about the Middle Ages and how there wasn't this break that might have been positive. So what allows you to, intervene in that way? And so I'm asking two questions, I guess. So why were people saying that about the Reformation, and what enables you to correct that?
Yeah, I have to admit, it's a question I'm uncomfortable with. And the reason why is, partly it's an invitation to say why I'm so intellectually virtuous, and others were vicious in some sort of way. And the reality is I don't really know why this was a blind spot. I can speculate. But I suspect that whatever my speculation is might not apply to the scholars who are working on this. So I'm not entirely sure why it's the case. I mean, I can tell you a lot of this is in printed sources. It's not a matter of me going out and finding documents that nobody has ever seen before. It's probably more likely a fact that I came with certain kinds of questions to this material. Like I said earlier, and I don't want to say this in a way of casting aspersions in any particular scholars, but this issue of a custody battle over the Church of England is a widely discussed kind of phenomenon. Not a lot of historical fields involve people spending a lot of time talking about what the religious beliefs of the various practitioners are. This is a field where that's absolutely the case. So in the question about the shift towards recognizing the vitality of late medieval religion, many people will say, how did Eamon Duffy write this big book he wrote called The Stripping of the Altars, which is this moving, evocative description of parish religion and how central it was? And a lot of people say, well, he's a Roman Catholic. Protestants couldn't see that about the late medieval church. They saw superstition. They saw, meaninglessness. Duffy had a certain lived experience that enables him to read those sources and perceive what was going on there, to realize that when people attend Mass and hear a priest speaking in Latin, maybe a Protestant sees that as alienating. And Duffy understands that something else is going on there that can be very satisfying. But again, I'm uncomfortable with that because it involves making decisions about what people's motives are, and I don't really know. I think for me, it was partly, and I'll explain, how I came across a lot of this. It was just finding stuff and being very surprised. I vividly remember sitting on my bed on a Saturday afternoon in Illinois in the winter and reading a pamphlet from 1536 that said that every parish should elect their priest. They can depose their priest if they want. If they have a priest that's elected for them who's not good, they should secretly, with 2 other families, form another church and not tell anybody. And I remember thinking to myself, this is unbelievable. So for me, the process was not so much having, I think, an idea or the germ of an insight. It was reading a ton of stuff and stumbling across a lot of things and then starting to formulate these ideas. So they didn't fit the older paradigm. I thought to myself, this shouldn't be happening now. It should be happening later. And I went and asked people, should this be happening now? And they said, no. And I had a project. So, Frank.
I'd like to make a comment to follow up on Yoko's question and then ask you a question that has a lot more to do with my own work, so I sort of apologize, but it has to do with...
I have no responsibility against it.
Well, it has to do with how you define radicalism.
Okay.
What is radical? But I would say, in response to Yoko's question, that you can kind of sidestep the ascription of nefarious motives or questionable motives.
Nefarious, but you know,
questionable
motives of some kind.
By noticing just how far back the assertion of the Church of England as the Via Media goes, and just how lively that discussion is. I mean, I've worked on, you know, some late 17th century and a lot of 18th century discourse along those lines. And it's just, I mean, it sounds to me as though the scholars that you're describing are heirs of a very, very long tradition of English self-definition, and especially ecclesiastical self-definition, but also national, you know, definition of character.
Absolutely.
So that's just a thought. But the question then is, so what is radical? I mean, because I'm working on something in the 19th century where I want to be talking about the presence of some radical thought or radical writings that haven't been seen that much as radical before. Can you characterize it more particularly than you have so far?
Yeah. You know, like I said, I think there are two conceptual choices here. There's one is to argue that radicalism is something that has a definable content to it. There are many historians who take this view, that there are certain ideas that just are radical. Democratic ideas are radical, or something like this. And it seems to me that the problem with this is that it ignores context, and that radicalism is an inescapably contextual sort of term. What seems radical in one context is not another. And this actually is a nice example with some of the things I'm writing about. Some of these evangelicals in the 1530s are translating texts written in Central Europe a couple of decades earlier that describe practices there which are very normal and not surprising. And if you said, let's elect our priests in certain parts of Central Europe, not a surprise. That's fine. That's what commune life is like. You translate that, you publish it in England, all of a sudden, it's a very radical call because it's about a call for change. And I guess that's the way I think about it. It's about demanding a change, and all calls for change are in one sense radical, but it's identifying ones that desire more change, more extreme change, more extensive change, more aggressive change than other people do. So it's always a matter about creating a spectrum of some kind. And I guess there can be some vicious tendencies in that certain people will always then get called moderates, but they're radical in their own sense, perhaps. So I suppose while I do put a lot of emphasis really in the talk here on the word radical, the focus in the book is not so much in saying that's radical. It's focusing on the ideas themselves and what makes them so different. I don't know that you get a lot of purchase out of saying early English Protestants are radical. You get a lot of purchase out of saying, look, these people wanted to get rid of bishops entirely. Yeah. Okay. Interestingly, too, I'm really struck by how the scholarship on radicalism, you see this in the volumes that are edited and things, usually begins about 1550 and goes forward, if it's even starting in 1550. There are a couple of recent collections that came out of conferences on radicalism, and it's 17th century, it's 18th century. 16th century seems not to have had radicals in England, you know. So, David.
News came out in the last couple of days that there were evangelicals that were showing up at the release of Kim Davis. I'm interested in how you use the term evangelical in the 16th century over against 20th, 21st understandings of the term.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not sure when this started. I would say probably in the 90s. There was a trend among English historians to stop talking about early English Protestants. So there was a sort of defining book written by a guy named William Klepsch in 1964 called, I think, England's Earliest Protestants. And that word Protestant was applied across the board to these sorts of figures. And the word evangelical started to be used because it's in fact what they would have called themselves. Sometimes they call themselves the evangelical brethren. And evangelical means, you know, a lover of the gospel, a follower of the gospel. Sometimes they call themselves gospelers, gospel men, the brethren, things like this. And that word evangelical started to be used, and I sort of use it maybe a little indiscriminately in this paper, to indicate that these are people who don't necessarily, especially early in the Reformation, have a coherent, tight set of ideas that line up with later confessional packages. So somebody might have what we would call a Protestant view of justification, but at the same time believe in the real presence. and that might sound Lutheran, but they might then have another belief that doesn't quite line up with that. So the word evangelical was accepted as sort of a fudge word that accepts the doctrinal fluidity of this early period. And you have Catholics that are referred to as evangelicals. Reginald Pole can be considered an evangelical, and Gasparo Contarini is an evangelical, and all these people that are interested in reform but don't yet have that calcified doctrinal systems that you get once the codification sets in with Trent or the other confessions. I must admit to a certain ambivalence about the word, because to me one of the difficulties is, when do you stop talking about evangelicals and start talking about Protestants? Where do you draw that line? There's a wonderful article by a historian named Peter Marshall on the naming of Protestant England, where he argues that the word Protestant actually functions as a polemical term. We think it's just neutral, but it's not. It's like Puritan or something like this. Please, nobody ask me to define Puritanism. So I think that's my best answer about the use of the word evangelical. It's a way of signaling that kind of fluidity. Plus, it's closer to what they would have said. Gospeler would be good.
You're not going to define.
I'm not going to define. I think it was Christopher Hill who famously said that Puritanism, the use of the word Puritanism, is a refuge from clarity of thought. I'd be happy to nod in with that. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a note for our internet audience watching at home. There's still plenty of time for you to call the number on your screen, and we can get Reformation Unbound shipped to you wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, you could order the book at the counter right through the alcove over there. Professor Gunther will be signing book plates for us, and I want to thank Professor Suzuki for presenting this, and please, another hand for Professor Karl Gunther. Thanks very much. All right.